Hey everyone, no intro to this video. We have got 15 minutes to cover 136 moves, 8 hours of chess, Game 6 of the 2021 FIDE World Chess Championship between Magnus Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi. Magnus with the white pieces, Nepomniachtchi with the black pieces. What an exciting game we had. Let's just jump right in. Magnus starts us off with d4. After knight f6, knight f3, d5, g3, e6. Bishop g2, bishop e7. We got a position very similar to what we saw in game 2 from Magnus last time Magnus was white. Kingside castles, both sides. If you remember from game 2, white played c4, and after pawn takes, Magnus played the really nice knight e5. In this game, Magnus goes for something a little bit different, plays b3, and after c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5. Now white offers the pawn. After d takes c4, Magnus, instead of recapturing the pawn, if white recaptures the pawn here, they've kind of got two awkward pawn islands. So instead of doing that, Magnus goes for queen c2. The idea being that if the pawn takes, the bishop hangs. So Nepo defends the bishop with queen c2, and then Magnus plays this really, really nice knight b to d2. The idea being that if black gets greedy and goes for the pawn here, we get knight takes with the tempo on the bishop moves back, and now this knight comes to d4. And white has got this really active knight, which is awesome. They've got this Catalan bishop coming alive. A lot of, the queen's got the open file. The rook's coming over. The pawn's coming up. A really tactically sharp line for white. And Nepo, I think, wanted to avoid all of that. So in this position, instead of taking the pawn, he played knight c6, just continuing with his development. After knight c4, Nepo found the really fantastic b5. Fantastic because this is probably not a line this is probably a line he didn't prepare for. And b5 can be a difficult move to find simply because you usually don't want to move your b pawn when your opponent has the potential for such a monster bishop. But he did it anyway. And the idea is that once this white knight moves, Nepo will be able to develop with tempo. Knight c5, knight b4, queen b2, bishop b7. Nepo continuing with his development. a3, pushing the knight back. Knight c6, this is a nice move, kind of keeping the tension in the position. And after knight d3, bishop b6, bishop g5, rook f d8, we're coming to the end of the opening, and we have bishop takes f6. So Magnus gives up the bishop pair, and this is a key position in the game. Nepo can either choose to take on f6, at which point there'll be a queen trade, and the black will have to capture back. They'll have the bishop pair, they'll have doubled pawns, but likely maybe a small advantage in the endgame, but it's looking very drawish. Nepo, I think, out for blood this game, plays g takes f6, which is basically a way of him saying, I'm not going to trade my queen, I'm going to fight to the end. And these guys did fight to the end. After rook ac1, we get knight d4 from black, a series of exchanges on d4, and white's queen eventually gets pushed to this really, really awkward a2 square. After bishop takes g2, king takes g2, queen b7 check, king g1, black has successfully removed white's powerful light square bishop. Black centralizes their queen, and white pulls their queen off that horrible a2 square. a5 from black, expanding on the queen side. Rook fd1. What white's going to do here is basically get ready to exchange their queen by protecting their queen with both their rooks so that the knight can eventually move. And here, Nepo had the decision either to push pawns and try and go for a positional win here on the queen side with these pawns, or to create a permanent material imbalance in the position, and he goes for the latter with rook ac8. White, I think, made the right decision to do queen takes c8, and then we have rook takes c8, rook takes c8. So what just happened is the white queen came off the board in exchange for both black rooks. If you're new to chess, you might be wondering, like, oh my goodness, isn't giving up your queen like the worst possible thing? The reality is that the two rooks working in coordination together can be as powerful, if not more powerful, than a queen. And if you think about it in an endgame, two rooks working in coordination can pick off pawns, and the queen by herself isn't going to have any ability to defend those pawns from two rooks. So rooks can be very, very powerful working together, especially in the later stages of the game. We get queen d5 from black, putting pressure on this weak b3 pawn. White pushes it. a4, e3, bishop e5, h4 from white, expanding on the king side, and h5. The computer doesn't like this move, but it's a very human move. White's expanding on the king side, and so is black. King h2. And now we get queen b2 from Nepo. This is a bit of an inaccuracy. A better move would have been queen b3. And it was at this point in the game, this was move 31, and both players were low on time. Magnus had 3 minutes on his clock, and Nepo had 14 minutes on his clock. So if you remember how time controls work in this World Championship, you get 2 hours for the first 40 moves, and then an hour added to move 40. So these next series of moves were really blitzed out until move 40, and that's why there's some mistakes being made. After rook c5, queen d6, Magnus missed here the rook c2. After this move, we got bishop takes, the knight coming here with both these rooks really putting a lot of pressure on the queen. The knight coming to h5, possibly to f6, and the potential for some type of meeting threat here on the 7th rank. The computers and all the commentators were talking so much about this line, but the reality is, with 3 minutes on your clock, it's not a surprise that Magnus missed a complicated line involving sacrifices and a kind of a theoretical mating net. So instead, Magnus played rook d1, and the computer says it's a blunder because it's missing the rook c2. After bishop takes a3, rook takes b5, queen d7, rook c5, we get e5. The computer doesn't like this move, but the reality is this is a really nice move. It's kind of a waiting move. It's a positional move. Now the knight can't come to f4. The knight's obviously pinned to the rook, so there's always the threat of e4. Here, Magnus played rook c2. The best move for black here would have simply have been take the pawn. And after the pawn gets taked, obviously the knight cannot capture because the knight is pinned to the rook. So after the white rook comes back, the bishop will just fall back to f8, and now black has this really nice passed pawn that is going to be a positional thorn in white's side, let's say. So the big tragedy is that Nepo didn't go for the free pawn for whatever reason, and instead played queen d5, and that was really Nepo's big mistake. That was a winning chance for Nepo, and he missed it. Rook d2, rook d2, showing up the weak rooks there. After queen b3, rook a2, we get e4 from black. Here, white plays knight c5, putting some pressure on the queen, and queen takes b4. Here, Magnus played knight takes e4, the idea being that if the black queen captures the knight, the bishop hangs. A real better move here would have been something like rook c2, and the queen can't go anywhere because it has to defend the bishop. So black has to do something with their king, and after takes, if the computer will move for me, takes, this bishop's pinned to the queen, and so obviously white can just win the bishop. And so then we'll be kind of in a drawish position, but maybe white has a bit of an advantage here. But obviously none of that happened. Magnus played knight takes e4, and after queen b3, rook ac2, bishop f8, black has that nice passed pawn we were talking about. Knight c5, queen b5, knight d3, black starts to push the pawn. White decides to shore up the pawn with rook a2, bishop b4, rook d3, king h6, holding king h6, protecting that h5 pawn. After rook d1, queen a4, now there's no chance that that pawn's going to become a queen. And we get some maneuvering here, where both players kind of probing around each other's position, and we get to this position right here. And this is a key part of the game. So you can see based on the last couple moves, neither player was doing anything. These rooks are really tied down to the defense of this pawn. This queen has to cover this square so that the white knight can't jump and eventually attack the pawn. Same with this square, right? The knight can come to this square. So the queen's well placed. This position looks very drawish. But Nepo decided to make some chances and play queen e4, effectively giving up the a pawn for white's h pawn. And again, this pawn here is pinned. So after rook takes a3, queen h4 check, king g1, queen e4, rook a4, bishop e5, right? So this knight is pinned to the rook. White plays knight e2 with a discovered attack on the queen. Queen c2, rook 1 a2, queen b3, king g2, queen d5 check, and f3. So what Magnus realizes is that as unpleasant as it is to push your kind of anchoring pawn, these pawns really do need to push in order for white to have any chances of winning this game. Queen d1, f4, a great move from Magnus. After the bishop moves, now that the pawn controls both these squares, there's no way for black to defend any of their pawns. These two pawns are on light squares. This pawn, can't really be defended. So this f4 move and the subsequent bishop retreat really works wonders for white's position. King f2, bishop b6, rook a1, queen b3, the idea being that this e3 square is very weak. After rook e4, king g7, rook e8, f5, rook a8, queen b4, rook a c8, bishop a5. Now black's going to try and break through here on the back rank. Rook c1, bishop e6, rook e5, queen b3, rook e8, and at this point we're on move 69. The players had a lot of time control issues, and each move they get an additional 30 seconds. So you might be wondering, why are the rooks dancing back and forth? And the reality is simply because each move gives each player another 30 seconds on their clock. Queen d5, rook c8, queen h1, rook c1, queen d5, rook b1, bishop a7. The bishop's got to go somewhere. Now we got rook e7, bishop c5, rook e5, queen d3, rook b7, queen c2, and rook b5. And this is a key position in the game here. Here the players repeated a couple moves simply because it adds time to their clock, so that was the reason for the little repeat right there. And now Magnus finally picks off the f5 pawn. So making progress slowly but surely for Magnus. After queen d3, oh, I spoiled it, but a fantastic idea for Magnus right here, which is rook takes f7 check, and after king takes, rook check, winning the bishop, and black has won the bishop. And so the next series of moves, what white is basically trying to do is figure out how to push e4, because they want to kind of run their pawns down black's throat. So after queen d5, rook a6 check, king h7, we get a series of moves where both players are kind of feeling around, and Magnus ends up creating this really nice fortress right here, where this knight is just fantastic against the queen in the close quarters here. So the queen has no checks in this position. Both players kind of maneuvering around a little bit. Magnus having a difficult time trying to figure out how to push this e4 square. You can notice all these moves that the queen is really covering this e4 square. Check. And again, we keep, this is kind of a recurring thing of this little fortress right here. A series of checks, the knight always coming back to f3, so you can see we've kind of been dancing around, neither player really figuring out how to make a kind of clear way of doing it until we get to this position right here, and Magnus finally figures it out. He plays knight g1, the idea being that the knight's going to come to e2, defend these pawns, the rook can come up to d4, the knight defend d4, and now we can push the e pawn. So really well done from Magnus, and in so many moves he basically achieves that. And so now what we have is the knight on this e2 square defending this pawn, the knight covering the rook, and now this e4 pawn can get pushed. And so that's exactly what Magnus does, pushes the pawn. The queen comes to h1, we get rook d7 check, king g8, knight d4, queen h2 check, king e3, h4, queen takes g4, queen h1, king d2, and queen takes h4. So now we are in an endgame where white has two passed pawns, a knight and a rook, versus a lone queen. And Chess Table, which is a computerized exhaustive database of chess endgames, says that this is drawn. This is like a drawn endgame. Theoretically, with perfect play, it results in a draw 100% of the time. The reality is that both players are low on time. Magnus has 2 minutes. Nepomniachtchi has 4 minutes. They get 30-second increments each move. But this is a great position for Magnus, who loves grinding out long endgames, to just exert pressure on Nepomniachtchi and let him make a mistake. So the next series of moves we have, white is making a fortress, and they're kind of moving their king over to the side of the board so as to avoid perpetual checks from white. So you see white is just, black is just checking white perpetually here. This pawn is now pinned to the king, and white has to figure out how to relieve all of these checks. And they end up breaking through. So there we go. There we got e5 from Magnus, queen a2, king h3. And so if black can continue making perpetual checks, it will be a draw. And the reality is that as these pawns get farther and farther up the board, even though, sure, they get farther up the board, the board opens up such that the black queen, it gets easier for the black queen to make checks. Here, Nepo makes the move that loses him the game. And the move that loses him the game is queen e6. So why does this move lose? Well, in order for the queen to give perpetual checks, she has to make use of the long diagonals. So the only moves that win here for black are queen b1 and queen c2, because it's from these squares that black has great control over the long diagonals and is going to be able to maneuver around and give perpetual checks. And this is really the effect, this is what Magnus was going for with this grinding out this long endgame, putting Nepomniachtchi under pressure and getting him to a point where he's in a position where he has a lot of different options in terms of where the queen can move, but only two moves. There's only two options that are correct, and you can't choose correct every time. So this is a logical human move because it pins the rook, and it allows the queen to come over top and deliver check. But this was a losing move for Nepo. After king h4, queen h6 check, knight h5, queen h7, e6, queen g6. Magnus had the great rook f7. So what's the idea with rook f7? Isn't the pawn hanging? Well, after queen takes, we get knight check. It's forking the king and queen. So the king obviously takes the rook, and after the knight takes the queen, the king takes the knight. We find ourselves in a classic king pawn endgame. So this is a win for white. So Nepo, seeing all this, is obviously not going to go for any of it. So after rook f7, plays king d8, and after f5, queen g1, Magnus plays the fantastic knight g7. What this basically does is creates a wall so that his king can be safe in this g8 square. So what's going to happen is Magnus is just going to maneuver back and eventually tuck his king away to safety. And excuse me, after this knight g7 move, it was in this position on move 136 that Ian Nepomniachtchi, playing black, resigned the game. So just to show you how it would continue, obviously, checks from black, but eventually the white king would make it very safely to this g8 square, and then there'd be nothing stopping this pawn from queening. So an exciting game, a game that had it all. Chances for Nepo to win, chances for Magnus to win more decisively earlier on, and a long, theoretically drawn endgame where Magnus really was at his best, grinding it out against the fantastic Nepomniachtchi, who has been playing really well this match, but will really have to show up with all the tricks to game 7 to equalize it in this chess match. So thanks for watching this video. I know it was a longer one, a long game. I should say that this is the longest chess game ever played in World Chess Championship history. The previous longest game was between Karpov and Korchnoi in 1978. It was 124 moves. So this was clocking in at 136 moves. Exciting stuff from both players. The game ended shortly after midnight in Dubai, so I'm sure both players will be getting rest. And I will see you tomorrow for Game 7.